My name is Ross Hamilton. I was born in 1948. You don't need to know that. But there you go. My research and the research of people I've worked with for many years now has been about the actual history and, shall we call it, prehistory of what is now the United States and Canada and parts of Mesoamerica. Because the white man came over here with such power and force with his gunpowder and his steel, he pretty much was able to tear apart the cloth of language that bound together many of the old tribes, especially in the eastern United States. And then he went about using a Gatling gun, of all things, to kill women, children, and men out in the West, because they were wise to what had happened in the East. So much of what I'm going to convey to you is strictly from Indian legend, and I give you my heart that none of it is made up in any way, and none of it has been extended to put across a point that I'd like to make. Why? Because everything fell together really well. It took a long time, but it fell together. The Adena and the Hopewell people was the first subject of our research. We know that archaeologists today are at least trying to be very progressive. So although it was back in the 1950s that the Adena people were the most important to archaeologists, later, after their deaths, John Dragoo, Ritchie, and Greenman and those guys, after their deaths, then the students of other teachers, very conservative teachers, came out and said, no, Adena means nothing. It was Hopewell. Look at all the wealth they had. Look at the mounds that they built. Well, if you look back at the Adena scholars, you recognize the fact that those mounds and that wealth was, in general, inherited from the Adena, because we find from the testimony of the Lenape that they made their way into the Ohio Valley and prospered well for about 300 years after they had defeated an indigenous tribe called the Allegheny. And you can find this in the records of John Heckewelder, who was a Moravian missionary. And also, if you prefer, the Red Bark record will give you a lot of good Lenape testimony. But nonetheless, much of the DNA studies that we prosper by today, as well as the other studies in minutia that we're pretty much resigned to, because most of the mounds were looted of not only their bones but their precious artifacts, have disappeared. There's been more disappearance than there has been written record of. And this goes back into history. There's a famous British philosopher who wrote that history is like a shipwreck. You can find less of it than you can the ship. So it's been. We have made no provisions to preserve history. And as a result, there aren't any libraries left from the ancient world, nor are there any tombs left over from before 1,200 years ago. I guess there are very few of any mounds that have not been looted that could give us any handle on history or prehistory. So we have to depend on oral tradition. I want to stress that point. Now, I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum. About 45,000 years ago, our world was covered with ice still. It was the end of what we call the Pleistocene period, which means ice and snow, excuse me. And what could we possibly know about anything that was going on 45,000 years ago? Well, I learned from Vine Deloria that Indian testimony can last a long time because they prepared their storytellers with absolute divinity. In other words, they were tried and tested of their moral stature well before they were given the responsibility of being their doctors and their storytellers. And you can ask any tribal tradition this, except those that have dispensed with it, that yes, the rigor involved in graduating to be a medicine man or woman or any kind of record keeper in any given tribe, especially in the East, and going into Sioux territory, was much dependent upon the moral aptitude of the individual entrusted with the work. So very much like the Irish, they remembered things word for word, and they passed these things down to the children, and they always made sure that somebody was ready for it. Well, 45,000 years ago, we hear from the Comanche, there was a very rough and brutish race that lived here in the United States and Canada, coast to coast. And he said, this chief, whose name was the Rolling Thunder, that they stood, a lot of you might doubt this, but many Indian people do not, 10 feet in height and more. And so we found evidence of this, skeletons in coal. We found evidence of men that stood 10, 11, 12 feet. But we've also found the evidence in some of the tools that they may have used. But most of all, we found it in other Indian testimony. The Iroquois teach us from earlier records, back during the colonial and shortly after period, that there was a race of giants that lived here that were very mean-spirited, and they stood very large in height. They didn't say 10 feet, but they were very large in height, and they subdued the native indigenous people almost to the point of extinction. But then, almost out of nowhere, the Great Spirit, who, by the way, was a common belief coast to coast, one God, which no white race or Jewish race or any other race for that matter can claim for any other part of the world. It was a struggle to have monotheism take over. I'm sure most of you know that. But not here. Everybody believed in Wakantanka or Gitche Manitou, the Great Spirit. So that's a clue that there was once a single civilization here that stretched all the way up to the Hudson Bay, down to the Gulf, and in the west, practically out to California. The Rocky Mountains, the Allegheny Mountains, and much of the territories in between believed in one God, and they profited and benefited from that belief. And they also believed that that one God lived in the north, and that you could see the lights above the lodge of the Great Spirit scintillating in the night sky certain times. And for those adventurous young men who went up toward the Arctic Circle, they came back with the stories of how the aurora was always being drawn into a great lodge that existed up there. Now, what I'm about to tell you is a continuation of the Indian legend. So please don't doubt it, because you'll only be depriving yourselves of this knowledge. If you don't believe in Indian legend, you don't believe in what can help us get out of this archaeological stronghold that we've been stuck in. Another race was sent by the Great Spirit, and they were called the Aramispi. And their headquarters were up in the Russian steppes, and they were known to have existed in what is now Iran. But they coexisted with these Boreadae, At first they were their guardians, but later on they became enemies because the Aramispi were truly beholding to the Great Spirit for their well-being. And when Hyperborea was founded, that's the name of the great lodge to the north, it was visited by the Greek Apollo, whom philosophers the world over, especially initiate philosophers, will verify was an actual man and that he constantly incarnates. He was Pythagoras, Apollonius of Tyana. He was many other incarnations, including David, some say, because he has to perpetuate his legacy. We're all immortal, and that's been his job, to teach self-knowledge. And so before the Great Spirit sent out the Aramispi to rid the people of the Western continent of these bullies, these gold-digging bullies, that's why they were there, because they were relieving the continent of masses of gold beneath the Rockies, and they were building golden cities on top of the mountains that they were taking the gold from. They were creating a civilization alternative to their forebears, the sons of Boreas, whom Apollo assigned to be the leaders of Hyperborea, because it was there that they made the nectar and ambrosia, distilling it from the aurora and the magnetic field of the earth into a divine liquid that was drunk. It was taken by all the gods in the ancient days and gave them both longevity and greater health, and even increased their height. So the Aramispi were privy to small amounts of this grand medicine to do the service work for Apollo, who visited them once a year, according to the Greek stories. Well, the Aramispi were white-skinned. The Boreadae were more liver-colored, and they had black hair and black beards. The Aramispi had red beards. The Iroquois said that when the Redbeards came, they routed all the Blackbeards and pretty much set everybody free again. And then the Redbeards took over the continent, and they took over the mining operations and took back the gold and gave it to Hyperborea, where it belonged. Now, here's the part where oral tradition plays also a very, very important role. There was a woman named Lucy Thompson. She was of the Yurok tribe, and she wrote a book in 1916 that was called To the American Indian. She wanted it to be read by the American Indian. I don't know if it caught on or not, but you can still get that book in Google Books for free. You can buy it from the Yurok tribe with many commentaries, but you can get the original unblemished manuscript right off of the Google search engine in their old books collection. In it, Lucy Thompson says that when her people first came into the Northwest, they discovered that the land was already inhabited coast to coast by a race of benign white people who immediately befriended us and all other Indian tribes that came. And I think she was referring to the Holocene period. And people that came before from the Alaskan Bridge and from the Pacific Ocean by boat and from places in the east and up from the south. They welcomed everybody, this race did, with open arms. And they taught them, according to Miss Thompson, all of their arts and sciences. Now, it's worthwhile to get this book because she has nothing but praise for these people whom in their language were called the Aramispi. Excuse me, the Wagas instead of the Aramispi. But we know that the Wagas and the Aramispi were one and the same from their physical description. So having said that, about the time that the Aramispi had to say goodbye, they were certain that they had trained all the native people to the point where they actually procreated with them, but only after a long waiting period to be sure that everything went without any promiscuity, without any lust, because all the children that were born between the fair-skinned and fair-headed Aramispi and the native people, some of whom were tawny-skinned, some of whom were light-skinned, some of whom were dark-skinned. Vine Deloria says there were many different races of skin colors when the white man first came here. And so it went that one day, after many, many of the native offspring, Lucy Thompson says, all those of 1/4 and 1/2 blood from the Aramispi and from native people stayed and became the leaders of all Indian people, coast to coast. And they had all the genetic superstructure and substructure of the Aramispi. And so when we read the Adena scholars, like Dragoo, for example, or Webb and Snow, telling us that some of the skeletons they were able to exhume before the great purge of the graves happened in the 1880s by the Smithsonian and others, were 7 feet tall. And so many of these 7-foot skeletons were dug up that I was asked by Native American leaders to write a book before this information gets lost, because the white man does not like the idea of instituting a belief that Indians were stronger, taller, and more intelligent than they are today. We, meaning his people, have been reduced to illiterate and basically undesirable people. And we have to fight against that. So please, please publish this. So I did. I'm not able to afford to print it out, but I got 4 copies of it. And you can also look it up online for free. It's a free download, and thank you for making your book free as well. So as we pursued this even more, we found over 1,000 newspaper and magazine articles and old township and diary records written by real people that were digging up these 7 feet, 7'5" and 8-foot skeletons that were undoubtedly descended from the original Aboriginal Indian people who were the family members of the Aramispi, who in turn granted them all their knowledge of technology and their sciences, enough to keep the whole of North America abrim with a life-giving essence. They were able to create these beautiful towers and earthen mounds and stone mounds, many of which survive to the current day, 1 or 2 of which are in your neck of the woods, that when they were working properly, drew to them the energies of the earth and the positive energies of the earth, and brought to a peak, and were able to attract the negative energies of the sky. And where these 2 energies met, precipitated into water, was a healing essence. And so in a new book I'm writing, and in Wonders and Mysteries, you can learn a lot more. I have that book over there. You can learn a lot more about the subtle technology that involved native people with living to be 200 years old, even within the last 5,000 years, and the ability to heal diseases. And their medicine class still knew these secrets. Vine told me that the reason Indians don't divulge them anymore is because they hate being taken to task and having their speech doubted by the white men. You know, they didn't want to draw the fire of skeptics. And there's skeptics out there even today who will say hateful things about Indians ever being 7 feet tall. But they were. They were bigger and stronger. And there's still some being born among some of the tribes, the Osage, for example, and some of the tribes down south still put out the occasional 7-foot man. Even when George Catlin was painting these people at the end of George Washington's presidency, or before his death, he painted men authentically seeing them himself who stood 7 feet in height among the mainly the Sioux, but also in the East. So there's no doubt in my mind about it. Why do we have so many people throwing doubt into this? Because it's so important to understand these facts before we can reconvene the school of medicine that they had. Vine said Indians lived to be 200 years old. And he said he also gave instances of people being healed by groups of medicine men coming together from various tribes and doing their magic, concentrating on a single individual. A child with a bullet in his head, barely alive, lived after his head swelled up because 30 or 40 guys got together, and gals, and healed him. But we know nothing about that anymore. Our modern medicine may be on the right track for many things, but what happened to spiritual? Why are we skipping, and doing all this rigorous, crazy stuff with the long stays in the hospital and the years of college, when all you should really be doing is praying and meditating and studying under a master of healing science? They exist, but they don't want to be known because somebody's out there is going to want to get rid of them, for sure. So over the 5,000-year period, before we had written records, going back to 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, the Aramispi were still here. But then one day, and Lucy Thompson says, this was the most tragic thing that ever happened to any of us. One day, they came to all of their native offspring and told them in no uncertain terms, our time here is done. We've been here for a very long time. We've brought you up in the ways of the Great Spirit. We've taught you how to love each other and to follow the golden rule. How many of us have followed the golden rule their whole lives? Don't anybody raise their hand unless you really have. Thank you for being honest. But they taught the native people to follow the golden rule, and they did it unequivocally, and that's why there was so much success. There was never any wars 7,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago. But one day they said, we have to go. We're being called back to the Lodge of the North. So I did research what lodge was at the North. And I found out that the only historical lodge, this mainly comes from the Greek legends, it was Hyperborea, the land of the north wind, where once long ago a temple was built and later a city around it that so well controlled the weather by controlling the magnetic field that it fine-tuned the magnetic field to a thin stream of electrons in the north. And some say they had a station in the south too, which is forbidden to visit at that time. And it was able to control the magnetic field so well that the weather pattern stabilized and actually started the Pleistocene. The snow fell all the way down to, I don't know what parallel it is, between the United States and Canada, all around the Arctic. And it just kept falling there. But up in the north, for, 40 thousand square acres, there was an eternal spring. They created a springtime and early summer environment there for people. Anybody that wanted to find salvation could make that trek. And it's believed that several thousand of these people, and some Indian people who had been purged of all their Eastern karmas that they brought with them from their family ties and traditions. The Chinese, for example, the Polynesians, they had a long history of warfare and cannibalism and what have you. But had they been able to purge themselves of those karmas, they were invited to go. And so many Indian people went with the Aramispi, and many Indian people volunteered to stay to help those who were left. And what did they do? They started something called, you ready for this? Turtle Island culture. That was the beginning, the very start of Turtle Island culture. And I know this from tribes that live around the Great Lakes. They still have it in their oral traditions, some of their families. But it hasn't gone much further out than that. Most Indians will tell you, Turtle Island, yeah, we're from Turtle Island. But they can't tell you if it was the entirety of the United States or in Canada, or if it was a small island at the top of Michigan, Mackinac. What it was a small island up at the top of Michigan called Mackinac. That's Turtle Island. And they had a great country that went from the Hudson Bay down to the Gulf of Mexico with its flanks on the prairies in the Atlantic Ocean that they called Manitoba, after their lord and sovereign, Gitche Manitou. And they created a wonderful effigy right in the center of their newborn country, which, by the way, we get the description of from the Smithsonian. The first director of ethnology spent many years among the Indians as a child, and he gave that description. Even though he doubted it, he still volunteered to give it, that there was once a great country here, operated by the Native American people when they were of a higher mentality, that stretched from the Hudson Bay down to the Gulf of Mexico, and so forth and so on. And it had, according to other legends, 7 major cities, which we have built cities on top of them, not knowing what's underneath us. There is a wonderful country laying dormant between us that is about to be resuscitated, because all that you see around us is illusion. Manitoba lives, and it has these brilliant lamps. Well, I don't want to digress. Let's get back to hard tax. So Turtle Island worked for a while, for a couple of thousand years, and at one time people came from all over the world to visit Turtle Island and absorb its culture, because it was known as the benign and beneficent land of giants, and places where things grew to gigantic size. Nuts and berries were big, and hardwoods grew to be titan in size, and the hardwood was harder than our hardwoods, because the process of growth never ended, because they're Manitous. They're effigies like the Serpent Mound, and many of those in Chillicothe, and all around southern Ohio, Indiana, and of course in Portsmouth, which is a major center, I have no doubt, and a few in Indiana, were all made to be distillers of the magnetic essence of the earth from both ends. The magnetic field runs through the earth as well as through the sky. And that's how the Greeks were able to formulate their hypothesis of the formation or the founding of nectar and ambrosia, and why men lived to be older and were stronger. You know, many of the old Greek historians said the same thing. We have records from reputable sources, which are lost now, of course, that say men were bigger and stronger and were more intelligent in the old days compared to now. And they lament the loss of real men and women because we were all more akin to gods and goddesses. So what is the difference? What makes the difference between a regular guy and a god who's, let's say, the same size? Let's say they're both 6 feet tall and they're both very handsome, well-developed musculature. What's the difference between them? Well, the difference is very much what the Aramispi had, that they were able to give to Indian people. The ability to rise above body consciousness and experience a complete freeing of the spiritual entity from where it sits behind the eyes. The soul of all men and women sits behind the eyes, not in the flesh and blood heart. That's the seat of emotions that the soul from here pours itself into. I had trouble with a woman a couple of months ago about arguing with me where the soul was. And I said, well, you can be tricked into believing it's here, but it's really here. That's the seat of consciousness. This is the seat of conscious emotion, and why there's so much power associated with it and its expressions. But from here, with a competent teacher, you can learn to rise above. And if you can clear out all of your karmas, it's like coming out of a sweat box. We're only about as big as a mustard seed. That's all the bigger the soul is. But we're immortal. Every one of you is immortal. Every one of you. I don't care what color your skin is. I don't care what sex you are. I don't care what race you belong to. If you have the human body, you have the immortal soul. And if you become what the Greeks termed self-realized by a teacher competent enough to take you above, even for a short time, to show you the brilliance of the heavenly worlds above you. Plato talked about it. Pythagoras talked about it. Many of the old Greek philosophers knew that self-realization is the key to understanding all the mysteries of life. Because once you've been taken out and put back in, you see everything differently. Everything. My master took me out in 1969, and when I came back, I could see inside this orange that somebody gave me. And I picked up the orange and squeezed it, and suddenly I could see all the seeds, and the flesh turned bright orange. So I squeezed it, and it was liquid light, and I drank it as liquid light. And that gave me my first sustenance that was of my own self-realization. So I suggest to you, if you can find a competent teacher, come and receive the initiate. It'll always be free. These men do not charge you. They never will charge. Most are in India, but there's a great plan to come to Serpent Mound, because the original Manitou, the original maker of the great medicine, what the grand medicine once was, is our serpent. It's missing its hardware right now, and people all know inherently that it really is the #1 sacred site, especially in the East. But few there be who realize it, because there's not that many who realize what they are, who they are. So as we approach this moment in time, there's going to be a great shift. For thousands of years, the whole holy scene has been in India, in Iran, and in the Himalayas, and parts of China. But all of the masters are now seeking reincarnation and getting it in the West. Not just Native American mothers, but all mothers who are eligible will be impregnated by their own husbands, but very special souls are walking amongst us now. They're children, but when they mature, and that's the key, to make sure they safely achieve adulthood, many of them are going to help us achieve that self-realization because it precedes God realization. And with them, guess who's going to come? The leader of all of us. The one who was all of the Messiahs. The one who was Buddha, who was Jesus, who was Muhammad. It has to have been one person because the people who live above us, they all elected this individual. He was Adam. And he and his wife will come and take residence and live for 800, hopefully to 1,200 years, and make sure that everything that I'm telling you comes to pass. But Serpent Mound has been designated as the grand center where we can come as safe refuge from the woes of the world as things get worse and worse and worse. All the seeds are in place. The pandemic, the economies are tanking all over the world. The negative power is taking over all of the radio stations, except for a few who resist it. And we're having our lives dictated to us by advertising masters. So rid yourself of that. And you'll find that just as sure as the Adena eventually had to defeat the last part of the Aramispian and Turtle Island culture, who were called the Allegheny people, by the time the Allegheny were in charge, they had lost their self-realization. They were divided into many city-states, and then it was easy for the Delaware, the Lenape, to defeat them. The Lenape took over the Ohio Valley, and they looked like the people they had defeated because the people they defeated were all giants still. But the Lenape were able to take them over and their women folk, and the Adena people became the giants. And that's why so many of the Adena people were tall, and they inherited that from a parentage that went back thousands of years. Okay, that should do it. Any questions?
I have one.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, by the way, for your presentation.
You're welcome.
From what I understand, in the book about Tecumseh, there was a story that there were white giants that lived in Kentucky, and that tribes around Kentucky conspired to go into Kentucky and kill the peaceful white giants.
I heard the same thing, but it wasn't white giants. It was a small contingency of white people that had the ability to make metallurgy work for them and so forth, and they weren't well liked. And this was, of course, within recent memory. And the Aramispi were here 10,000, 9,000 years ago. And I heard the same story. The great battle at the Falls of Louisville marked the end, and they could have been a Welsh race, for all I know, for all anybody knows. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
When the consciousness in your head floats above in the air, does it manifest? Can you see it?
People that are sensitive have also gained self-realization, can see it, yeah.
What does it look like?
Well, it just looks like an outpouring of light and sheaths of light. It's white, yeah, and it can be golden, but you're not up for the very much at first, because you know they have to sustain your physical body but while you're up, you drop off sheaths of karma until they denude you from being the size of a softball down to the size of a tiny pea.
Well, I wondered because the Vedas say that they're like the size above heads of yogis and other people. What we should call them.
Yeah, the saints are the ones that perform rising above body consciousness. Not all yogis are yogic adepts. Some are, but they don't advertise, and they don't sell anything that they perform in the way of spiritual duties. It's a good question. Thank you. Yes.
Will there be like a group of people coming here? Like, are you talking about like everybody kind of coming to the mountains?
Well, that'll happen too. I think as word gets out, you'll see more and more people living in Adams and Highland County buying in to a great event that's going to happen here. I dare say that it might culminate in a public resurrection, a public rising above body consciousness, so that everybody can know what it takes to transform an entire nation into a nation of ascended masters. Any other questions? Yeah, I'm going to be publishing through Inner Traditions for this one. And it'll cover all this that I talked about today. Not for another year or so. They have a lot of books that they publish, and we haven't even had a working title yet. But it'll be something like The Rise and Fall of Turtle Island Culture. Yeah. Then, yeah, the United States was once, and Canada was once in the shape of a great phoenix. And as we move along, and as the lamps beneath us put out more and more of that light, there's a place in Tennessee, in Sunbury, Tennessee, on Peaky Mountain, that has a sun disk without the sun disk on it. It still puts out a lot of electrical energy, but it was one of many that existed all up and down the backbone of the Phoenix from Sault Ste. Marie down to Florida. And when these sun disks were burning, they put tremendous amounts of ether into, the living ether into the atmosphere and the earth. And that's how Manitoba attracted so many people from all over the world, because it was like a paradise here. So that paradise is going to be restored. 2 minutes? Okay, good. So that's not a prediction to me, but it may be to you. But this is a spiritual technology that's coming to us, and we should know a lot more about how to get right with Gitche Manitou and begin to rebuild at least the likenesses of many of these ancient earthworks and some of the old temples from around the world that were better suited to make the medicine. And if you read between the lines of many of the old Greek myths and the Native American stories, you'll see that there was once a great and universal medicine that kept everybody alive and continued to grow, so that men and women indeed lived to be 800, 900 years old, and things were completely different. The earth was completely different. But after the lights were switched off, all of the illusion slowly fell back. And right now we're living on a huge bed of rock and plants that were deposited there after the lamps of Manitoba switched off. There's only 1 or 2 of those sun disk bases left in the world that I know of, but I heard the Iroquois have one that they don't let anybody talk about or see. Yes.
You once talked about all the different mounds that were in like a zodiac type of circle.
Yeah, that's in one of the books I have over there.
Is that how they found all of the mounds?
Yeah, they're all fit right into the zodiac.
So like when they found the last one, did that open up anything?
No, because when the archaeologists were finding them, it was back in the 1900s or 1800s. The Friends of Serpent Mound and myself were, through studious endeavors, were able to put together the zodiac with a serpent at its center. Now that zodiac has to be put back into working order for we to have any lift of consciousness. I think I'm out of time, but I appreciate